I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. While the discussion is at full volume with Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court, the leaking of the document that basically says they overturned it, we have on the doorstep, we're facing a real possibility of a nuclear exchange with Russia. So I'm going to, while everybody's looking over here, I'm going to bring on a very good guest, very knowledgeable, very good sourcing, very good journalist, very good economist, a PhD, who is been following this story, and what he has been writing about is just leading you down the path of, oh, this is a problem. We could get into a big nuclear conflict. It is Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. Of course, I'm talking about Ukraine and the ever ratcheting up of hostilities with a nuclear-armed, hypersonically armed country.
Pleased to be with you again, Greg.
Good to be. Well, you wrote. I'll just start with the stuff you've written, which is fabulous. It's on paulcraigroberts.org. It's for free. Washington and Moscow have combined to make the Ukrainian situation into Armageddon. Just the last two articles are stunning. All of them are good, but just the last two. Putin's liberalism means a wider war is in the cards in Ukraine. He hasn't acted strongly enough. It's given him time to train pilots, Ukrainian pilots, and lease them F-16 jets. And I mean, people have no idea that we're stumbling into a nuclear war. Please, let's start there. Are we stumbling into a nuclear war?
Certainly the risks are higher than ever. People have kind of given up on nuclear war because they've been hearing about it for 60 years, and it hasn't happened. The big scare was in the early 60s with John Kennedy and Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so it didn't happen then, and it hasn't happened. And so it's just one of those things people have heard about for so long that they dismiss it. And then, of course, they don't get good information about what's going on because Washington always has a narrative. And the narrative always serves Washington's interests, its foreign policy or whatever it's up to. And that narrative is always controlled. So there's no real alternative narrative. And for these two reasons, that they don't have good information and that they are accustomed to hearing about nuclear war for 60 years, it's not understood as a serious possibility. I regard it as a very serious possibility for two reasons. In part, it's the Russians' fault because they don't respond in any aggressive way to the provocations that Washington gives them. They almost don't respond at all, except with a few words. They rely on reason, negotiation, agreements, and that indicates they don't understand that they are seen by Washington as an obstacle to Washington's hegemony. They're in the way, and Washington wants them out of the way. And so they have been very slow to perceive that there's not a misunderstanding. There is a determined Washington effort to move them aside, to reduce them as a constraint on American unilateral action. And clearly, Washington wants to break them up from Europe and break them up from China. Because if Washington can reduce Russia's ability to constrain Washington's unilateralism, And then that leaves China on its own. And so then the same effort can be made against China. So it's the Russians for years and years who have accepted provocations, very low kinds of response. And this has encouraged the West, since the provocations are costless to the West, to increase the provocations and to make them worse. And with Ukraine, they have gotten really worse. Not only did the Russians face the threat of Ukraine becoming a NATO member, they also faced the threat of Russia's humiliation because the United States had trained a Ukrainian army, and it was on the borders of Donbass. The borders were already shrunken by the Nazi militias, which had infiltrated and taken a number of the villages. But they were now threatened at the beginning of this year with a major Ukrainian invasion. Now, what is the Donbass? It is a region of the Ukraine that originally was part of Russia. And during the Soviet period, when Ukraine and Russia were all the same country, the communist leadership put part of Russia into Ukraine. It may have been for administrative reasons. It may have been to water down the Ukrainian population with Russians to make it more stable. But for whatever the reason, the Donbass is a Russian population. And so if the Russians had accepted this invasion of Donbass, there would have been a tremendous feeling of shame throughout Russia. It could very easily have destabilized Putin. So that was the second reason that the Russians had no alternative but to intervene. So they're threatened with NATO, they're threatened with the massacre of Russian people, and they have to do something. So if they had acted 8 years ago, when the United States overthrew the Ukrainian government and put in place an American puppet government, at that time, the Donbass, just like Crimea, requested to be reabsorbed into Russia. They said, we want to go home. We voted, take us back. And the Kremlin refused. Well, if they had taken them back, there would have been no 8 years of shelling of Donbass. There would be none, this type of intervention would not have happened, because the Ukrainians would not have shelled Donbass if it was part of Russia. So it was the inability of the Kremlin to act at the appropriate time that has led to a worsening situation. And now the situation is worse than ever, because when the Russians finally intervened in Donbass, they did so in a very limited way. The so-called invasion is focused on the Donbass area. It's to clear out the Ukrainian armed forces in that part of the Donbass. And so it's a limited operation. It's going slowly because the Donbass are Russians, and so the Russians don't want to be shelling their own people in order to clear out the Ukrainian military. So it's a very slow process to avoid the huge civilian casualties that would occur if the Russians just decided to wipe out the Ukrainians quickly with heavy weapons. Well, the time that passes has given Washington and NATO, which is a Washington tool, many opportunities for more provocations to widen the war. And now we have the reports that Washington intends to use this war to break the Russian back, to cause attrition to Russian armed forces. Washington has passed a Lend-Lease bill. We're going to be sending not just artillery and heavy weapons to Ukrainians, but also F-15 fighter jets. We're training the Ukrainians to fly these planes. They're being trained both in the United States and in American bases in Germany, so that they can pilot the American jets. So, in other words, we're getting involved in a way that we are a combatant, not directly so far with troops, but with making sure that the Ukrainian army, which is being destroyed by the Russians, is replaced by new elements from Western Ukraine, trained by the Americans in how to use the American equipment, the American fighter jets. So this will further delay a military solution in Ukraine. It provides more opportunities for more provocations, more miscalculations. And finally, to wrap this up, we are now, that is, Washington is now pressuring Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Now, when I say pressure, yes, they pressure, but they also simply pay the rulers. They hand them bags of money and say, here, is this enough? Will you sign? And so we'll have a situation, if it's unacceptable to Russia for Ukraine to be in NATO, it's certainly going to be unacceptable to have Finland.
Yeah, on their border.
Sweden, yeah, it enlarges the border area that Russia has with NATO. And so in the middle of a serious situation that could already go out of control, we are adding new provocations. So it's clear that Washington intends to push these provocations to the hilt. You know, in a normal, sane world, everyone would understand that it's recklessly irresponsible to put Finland and Sweden in NATO, particularly at the present time. So that's the sort of concerns that I have. The Russians have a very high tolerance for provocations, and therefore the provocations that the West commits against them never have any cost for the West, and they increase in number and severity. At some point, these provocations are just too much to stand, and that's where you cross the line and the situation becomes nuclear. On Washington's side, the Neoconservatives, who control our foreign policy, are committed to American hegemony. And they believe it. They think they can win. And if you have that kind of mindset, you push too hard, you provoke too much. And I think that's the sort of point that we're coming to. We're going to reach that point. And at that time is when the high risk of the mushroom clouds going up all over becomes real.
You had said something really important that just stuck with you. You say a lot of things really important that sticks with me, but I'm just going to name one of them. You say a lot of, good thing. Well, when I first called you about this, I read your post get sent to me in the mail. And, it was the hold on. It was the well. First of all, before we move on, you said this in your post from Sunday. Putin's old-fashioned 19th century liberal beliefs are no match for Washington's 21st century Satanism. You think this is pure evil, what we're doing to Russia?
It's pure evil, but it's not just to Russia. We're doing it to ourselves, and we're doing it to the Ukrainians. We're doing it to the Germans, the Swedes, the Finns, the Poles. American hegemony, the neoconservatives are so committed to it that the costs don't matter to them. They won't just fight to the last Ukrainian. They'll fight to the last Finn, the last Swede, the last German. They'll even risk a nuclear war with American cities going up in Armageddon. They're so committed. I mean, you know the story. The end of history, the last man. There's no alternative to America. We're exceptional. We're indispensable. We have the right to rule the world. This is an ideology. It's just as strong an ideology as original communism was in the early years of the Soviet Union. It's a very strong ideology that the neoconservatives have, and they're committed to it. And so, and they think they're winning. They think that they have Russia in a trap. They think that the more the Russians use force, or they can expand the Russian use of force, that the more that happens, the more the world gets angry about Russia, and the more they accept us as saving them again, like we saved them from the Nazis. And so
now we're backing the Nazis.
Now we're backing them, yeah. But it's sort of a self-perpetuating mindset, and that's the problem. Now, Putin is a liberal. He's a Russian liberal, and what is meant by that, as I understand it, is that there are people who think that Russia is part of the West, and that its future lies with the West, and so therefore it has to get along with the West. And I think that's the reason the Russians never put their foot down to stop the provocations, because, that might ruin our relations with the West. If you look at it, even now, Greg, look at it. Right now, here we are. We're arming Ukraine. We're building another Ukrainian army to replace the one that the Russians are destroying. We have passed a Lend-Lease bill. We're going to be supplying them with American jet fighters. We're training their pilots how to fly these planes. All the European countries are complying with the sanctions against Russia. We've stolen their central bank reserves. And what is Putin doing? He's still selling energy to Europe. He refuses to nationalize the Western firms that are pulled out of Russia. They still think they have to take it easy on the West and not ruin relations. And so they don't even take sensible steps that would help them in this conflict in Ukraine. Why in the world, with Ukrainian pilots being trained in Germany and Germany sending military equipment to Ukraine, would the Kremlin continue to sell energy to Germany? Why? If the Germans don't have this energy, they're going to have to close down their factories.
Yep.
They wouldn't be able to participate in the struggle against Russia. So here's Russia enabling its enemies to oppose it, because Russia's so afraid he might hurt their feelings if he turned off the energy, and they wouldn't be accepted by the West. Well, of course they're not accepted by the West. You know, it couldn't be made any clearer than Washington has made it. When Biden says Putin has to go, he means it.
And I wanted to touch on that because I talked to you about this. You brought this up, and I said, you know, I can't believe Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, saying, "Oh, we want to drag this out and weaken Russia." And you said they want regime change. Talk about that.
What was
that Lloyd Austin said they wanted to stretch this out, and you know, they want 33 billion. They want to stretch it out. They don't intend to win it. They want to just weaken Russia. And you said they want regime change. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well. They thought, and may still think, various factors would cause regime change. One was the sanctions, that the sanctions were going to hurt so many influential interests inside Russia, as well as the Russian people, that it would weaken Putin as the president, and that he could be replaced simply from the dissatisfaction that the sanctions would cause internally in Russia. So that was one thing. Then they got to thinking, well, look, if we can prevent this war from coming to a quick end by prolonging it, by feeding in more equipment, more money, training, helping them raise another army, and the longer we can keep this going, the more it's going to wear down the Russian population. There'll be combat deaths. Perhaps the Kremlin will have to establish conscription. There can be shortages of commodities in Russia and so on. So they see that as an additional way of pressuring. And then Oliver Stone, the other day, Oliver Stone said, look, you know, the demonization of Putin and Russia is so extreme and is so contrary to the reality that it's now possible for there to be a false flag, low yield, nuclear explosion somewhere in Ukraine, because it'll instantly be blamed on Russia. And the whole world would just be an uproar, and that this could be used to dethrone Putin. So these kinds of plans, they make the neoconservatives giddy. They get all giddy. Oh boy, we can see all these things we can do. And the more giddy you get, the more reckless you get. And this is what I mean about why there's such a great risk of this going nuclear. Currently, there are no Ukrainian forces that could be used to attack the Russians. The Russians have the Ukraine surrounded in the eastern part. If the Ukrainians had any other forces, they would be attacking the Russians from the west. They'd be attacking the Russian rear. Well, they're not there, which proves that Putin was correct when he said the army was in the east preparing to invade Donbass, and that's one of the reasons the Russians had to go in, to prevent that slaughter. Well, if we succeed in raising another army, or if, as some reports are, the Poles are going to send in peacekeepers to Western Ukraine, and you start building up a NATO peacekeeping unit in Western Ukraine, where the Russians have no boots on the ground, then that becomes a shield for another Ukrainian army. So the possibilities that Washington sees of continuing this indefinitely are large. And the longer it continues, the more the chances for provocations and miscalculations. And you can certainly see if Russia gets mired down there and we put Finland and Sweden in NATO, they're going to feel very threatened. And Putin will at some point have to give up being so liberal and so at ease with provocations and our Western partners and all that way of talking and thinking. Just survival will explode all of that kind of nonsense. And the Russians will finally have to start fighting. And if that happens, then that's when it can come to an end. Everything can come to an end.
Whoa. How fast do you think this could? It's really unfolding at a breakneck speed. I mean, nobody's seeing this with all the Sotomayor and somebody leaked and Supreme Court Roe versus Wade 50. Nobody is watching us stumble into a war that could hit the United States. People think, oh, we'll never get hit. I mean, with our border wide open, you think Russia couldn't send teams of people in to blow up our? They just had one of their refineries, one of their oil depots blown up. They couldn't have, Houston hit, right?
No, I don't think the Russians would bother with that. If they feel threatened, if they think they're going to be overwhelmed just because the border area with NATO is just too large. Look, Russia's a big country, but its population is dwarfed by the European population.
Yeah, 160 million or something.
165 million Russians is, what is it, 450 Europeans, 450 million Europeans. So if this becomes a real war rather than what the Kremlin intended, a limited military operation in eastern Ukraine, it becomes a real war, and they're forced with eventually. I mean, they're fighting. They will be fighting the American military security complex. The arms makers here. I mean, that's the industry we still have left. It's the arms. If we start making the airplanes and tanks and howitzers and all that's being funneled into the western Ukraine, where there are no Russian troops on the ground, and I mean, maybe it'll all be blown up as it lands, never reach any Ukrainian units. The Russians seem to be effective with their precision missiles in wiping out arms storage depots that we established, and maybe that will continue. But maybe not. Or if these F-15s start operating out of German bases, out of Polish bases, how are the Russians going to permit that? They won't. Then they'll start taking out the bases in Germany and Poland. And you can see from there how it becomes a real war. And these are distinct possibilities. It's not a certainty that this will happen, but these are very probable events. Given the attitudes that have been expressed in Washington and by the NATO Secretary General and by the European governments, or by most of the European governments. And if you look at why in the world would Washington at this time be pressuring Finland and Sweden to join NATO? It doesn't make any sense in terms of the danger in the situation. It's recklessly irresponsible because it becomes a greater provocation for Russia. So how much can you provoke them before they let loose. And then it hits the fan. So I see everything Washington is doing is designed to further provoke Russia. And this strikes me as just dangerously irresponsible. No president in our history has ever done that. Whoa. Nobody in the Cold War provoked Russia. It just wasn't done. You avoided that. You tried to reach reasonable understanding, as Kennedy achieved with Khrushchev, and as later Reagan achieved with Gorbachev. So what we are witnessing is unprecedented. That's why it's dangerous. Washington is doing everything it can think of to provoke Russia, to raise the tensions more dangerously. And this is not what you do with a nuclear power. And it's irresponsible of Washington. It's irresponsible of the European Union. It's irresponsible of NATO. If the Swedish and Finnish government asked to join NATO at this time, it's just recklessly irresponsible. Nuclear weapons, there won't be any Europe. There won't be any Europe. And why should Europe die just so the neoconservatives can realize their ideology of American hegemony? I mean, that's what we're talking about. You have an ideological movement. The neoconservatives are every bit as ideological as Lenin and Trotsky. Every bit. And they believe just as strongly. And the risks to them are not important. They have a goal. They believe in it. And if you're like that, if you're really a fanatic, you don't know risk. Risk doesn't exist for you. And so that's the danger. It's a serious situation. It's very serious. Well, as I said in the beginning, Greg, people are used to, there won't be any nuclear war. We've been hearing about this forever. It's something from the past. Plus, we have all of the extraordinary propaganda, the war propaganda. And this prepares people to think that, Russia is just totally evil and are losing. I mean, a lot of people think Russia's losing. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, my old newspaper, yesterday. It was by Peggy Noonan. I mean, I used to know Peggy Noonan. She was actually the wife of one of my best friends. And she says, the Russians are losing. So people believe that somehow a Ukrainian army surrounded, shrinking, unable to conduct offensive operations, trapped, that they're defeating the Russians. Do people believe this?
Total lie.
I don't know anybody that doesn't believe it.
Yeah. I wanted to get, you're a former Treasury Secretary. I mean, you have this nervous laugh, and people I will say this, people say that, he starts laughing, and I said, yeah, it's a nervous laugh. It's not like it's not like you think it's funny. It's like you think it's so absurd.
It is funny that people can believe the opposite of the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, how can you? No, it's not a nervous laugh. It's just, it strikes me as, I mean, I don't think it's funny we're going to get blown up, but I think it's funny that in the 21st century and all this communication and high tech and science and blah, blah, and people have no idea whatsoever of reality.
Very good.
It's like you say, well, they're very aware of Roe versus Wade, but they don't know they may be blown up any minute.
Yeah. I mean, I read your article, and then you say, "Oh, go read my one before." And so I did, and I went, "Oh God, this is awful." I mean, this is. I mean, I'm going to put your links up to your website. Even the Pope is out today saying this is going to air Tuesday night. So he says Pope admits NATO likely provoked Russia's invasion, but nobody's going to see that. Nobody's going to see that that we are the NATO and the U.S. is the cause of breaking this 1991 agreement, and where they were, where Ukraine gave up all these nuclear weapons, and they were going to be made in 1991 neutral and never be a part of NATO. That all, it's unbelievable. We broke these agreements. I mean, you listed out one after another provocations by Russia. My thing is, when is it going to go snap, boom? Okay, with the ding, because it's not going to be something gradual. It's going to be, okay, all right, fine, okay. When is that going to happen? And the answer is, I don't know, but it will.
Well, it will. It will, the way things are going. A limited military operation, if it turns into the 10-year war that we have said is our goal, how can it without the Ukrainians being able to use NATO territory for their staging operations, for their airfields?
When does Russia start hitting the NATO territory?
That's it. When do they say, well, we've already said if you get involved, you're a combatant. And then if there's just too much of NATO involved, too many countries, it may just exceed their conventional capability. And so that's when tactical nukes start going off.
You had famously said before, and it's just one of the things that you give, hey, you better hope they don't get backed into a corner, the Russians.
Yeah.
You better hope they don't. And I was like, oh, then they'll be forced to use nukes.
Yeah. If they see something like that, and of course they're better armed. I mean, their weapons are hypersonic. They change course. They can't be shot down. An anti-ballistic missile system is useless against them. This probably gives them confidence. But when you have a situation for the West, you have to remember now, it was just, it was in January, wasn't it? When January, February, the Russians were holding security conference meetings with us, with NATO, trying to make us understand that they have a security concern with NATO bases on their borders, American missile sites in Poland and Romania. And if Ukraine is NATO, then in Ukraine, 3-4 minute warnings for them. This is unacceptable. And everybody should understand that. It should be unacceptable in Washington. We should know, of course, we can't do that. No administration ever tried to do anything like that. And instead, we just give a cold shoulder. That's your problem.
I know.
We're going to put NATO wherever we want it, and it's your problem. Well, this is unprecedented. This is far worse than anything that happened in Cold War I. And there's no public outcry about it.
You can't. You cannot talk junk about this war. You can't talk junk about the stolen election. You can't talk about facts. Sorry, not junk. Facts. You can't talk facts about the vaccine, which has, I don't know, up to 25,000 deaths, and they're lying about all that. You can't. Dr. Pierre Corey said we killed 800,000 people by not using the preemptive care. 800,000. You can't talk about that, and you can't talk about how evil this is in Russia.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, how dangerous. Really, how dangerous. We're tripping
Well,
toward. Oh, I love the Patriots are my team. Oh, the Cardinals are just won in Arizona. You're stupid.
yeah, it is. You're right.
I want to talk a little bit about the economy. Your former Assistant Treasury Secretary, supply side economics. I've made a mistake and said that in the past, and I'm sorry for doing that. You're a big reason why we had such a great 1980s for the economy in Reagan. You basically counseled Reagan on the economy, what you need to do, and they did. And it took off like crazy, and it was fantastic. So you know a lot about the economy. You know a lot about what's going on. Are we headed for a big crash, a big hyperinflation? We're at 8.5%. The Fed is, I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to cut this out. I just had Jim Rickards on. They're going to kill the economy. They're going to shut it down in weakness. John Williams also says, well, we had a failed holiday season. They're going to tighten into weakness. So what do you think, if just in a short amount of time, are we headed for a big crash in the economy, a big hyperinflationary type thing, then deflation and depression? What are we headed for?
Greg, I don't know, and nobody knows, least of all the Fed. All I can say about this is that the Federal Reserve has a concern limited to the big New York banks. What happens to the economy is not a concern of the Fed, but what happens to the big banks is a concern. So the Fed will protect the big banks
at the expense of we the people.
It could be at our expense, or it could actually end up helping us. It just depends on the situation. But the economy is not the playing field for the Fed. It's, are the banks sound? Are they solvent? Are they going to crash? Is their balance sheet holding up? And so I don't think the Fed will take actions on inflation that threaten the banks. I can see a new development where the Fed has to raise interest rates a little bit to support the dollar, but continues to purchase all the bad assets, all the bad investments that might be on the bank's books. It's unclear how what's happening to Europe because of the sanctions, that's strengthening the dollar, because now the Europeans, the euro now has to be more heavily produced to import more expensive energy to replace the Russian energy and other commodities they're now denied by the sanctions. So as the euro infusion into the world economy rises, the dollar gets stronger.
Wow.
So you can see the sanctions in a way, because of the hurt they do to Europe, strengthens the dollar. Or can have this effect. So it's just hard to know. And also, we had so much money creation since what, 2008, and according to the official figures, there was hardly any inflation. There was never enough to satisfy the Federal Reserve. So all of a sudden there's inflation. Well, I think a lot of it comes from the lockdowns, because the supply chains were so damaged, and things were just, when factories are closed and businesses are closed and transportation systems are impaired, supply just diminishes. And if supply diminishes and the money side doesn't, prices go up. So there are, of course, now other factors causing rising prices. I think the Many of the corporations take advantage of the situation and raise prices. And of course, the sanctions cause all kinds of disruptions and higher costs. But my own view is, in light of the danger of the situation in Ukraine, it doesn't pay to worry about the economy. It's not the worry that we face. The worry we face is that we continue these provocations. They get more and more outrageous. They get more and more reckless, the provocations do. It's clear, it has to be clear to the Russians now that they are at war with us. I mean, if we have Lend-Lease and we're sending F-15s and training the Ukrainians how to fly them, then the Russians have to know that they're already at war, that World War III started. It's already started. They have to know this. They can't continue to pretend like this is a limited operation and they're going to get it over with and go home. Or they can't pretend like, once we go home, they'll move the sanctions and we'll get all our business back in Europe. And they just can't any longer live in this sort of naive trust of the West that's characterized them in the 21st century. It has to change. They have to say, good God, we're at war. We're at war. This is war. And that's what's dangerous. Where does that go? I mean, and if they look too indecisive or they're too ineffective in protecting themselves, they're going to lose the alliance with China. China's going to say, well, look, these guys, what's the point in being in alliance with the Russians? They don't even look after their own self.
Oof.
So you can see at some point this lightning is going to strike somebody in the Kremlin. They're going to say, hey, we're at war. This is World War III. It's got to happen. I mean, why isn't it World War III? We're sending them another $33 billion to Ukraine, another. And all the planes, the equipment, the training. And allegedly there are Polish forces and Moldovan forces concentrating on the Ukraine border. And who knows? Because a report like that comes along, it dies. The narrative doesn't even give it the advantage of acknowledging it. I mean, we don't even get CNN to say it's not true. They just don't acknowledge it. So you don't know. You just have no idea what's going on in all these ways. But we do know, because the Pentagon admits it, that we're training the pilots, and we're giving them F-15s. And so that means they're going to start challenging Russian air control in Ukraine. Well, that has to widen the war.
Yeah.
There's no way around that. It has to. And so, it's a dangerous situation. And it's 10 times more dangerous because, as you say, there's nobody talking about it. Nobody's aware of it.
These are all stuff you can source. You're a PhD in economics. You got a big resume, but you're also a top-notch, globally award-winning journalist. And you're just quoting one source after another. I mean, these aren't stuff you're making up or what you think. This is the stuff that you can source. And if you just have two neurons touching together, wow, this is getting bad.
Yeah.
And,
none of this is my opinion.
I know that.
Well, it is my opinion that if you don't reply, if you don't stop provocations, they get worse. And incidentally, I saw just the other day the Chinese government said that. one of the Chinese government spokesmen said, we cannot accept any provocation from Washington. The minute we accept one provocation, there'll be 10 more.
Well, I mean,
see, now that's a lesson the Russians have been very slow to learn. But the Chinese already know it. They've already said it. Oh no, we won't accept a single provocation from the Americans. So it's not, so I'm kind of confident if Chinese think that way, there's probably something to my position that when you accept provocations, you get more and worse.
And we are stumbling towards ultimately a nuclear war. In your assessment, we're stumbling towards a nuclear war.
Yeah. We're on the, that's the avenue we're traveling on, and it's not possible to discuss it except to blame it on Putin. We can blame it on Putin like Peggy Noonan did in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, I think. So since it's Putin's fault, it's not anything we're going to worry about.
I mean, everybody's so cavalier about we're going to have a nuclear exchange. I mean, ultimately, they have to know this, right? They have to know that at some point it'll go nuclear. They have to know that. That's stupid. They have the war college, and they play games, and they have scenarios. They simulate. They have game there. They have to know at some point they're going to provoke a nuclear war, right?
Yeah, they have to know that. But you know, just as it's hard for medical doctors to say something about the COVID protocols without getting fired or canceled, if you're part of the foreign policy community, you're not really permitted to get very far off the common view. If you get very far off the common view, you get shut down or ignored, or you cease to be a player. And we don't have any more people like Stephen Cohen. He was the Russian expert that died a couple of years ago. He dates from the original Cold War. And he was one of the few who could always say, now, wait a minute, there's another side to this. Let's look at it from their perspective. He was very helpful during the Cold War to stop the hawks from being too provocative or making a miscalculation by reminding everybody that there's always two sides to a story, and it's best to understand the whole story. Well, there's nobody like that anymore. I try to play that role, but I'm excluded from the foreign policy discussion. They wouldn't dare pay any attention. If they were to if the editor of Foreign Affairs gave me a forum there, he'd get fired.
Well, we had Tulsi Gabbard, who's, not you, but still, she came out and said, wait, whoa, basically, hey, whoa, on this war thing, hold on a minute, wait, whoa. And Pierre Delecto, Mitt Romney, calls her a traitor.
Yeah.
I think, you can't even object to the possibility of a nuclear exchange with a hypersonically armed superpower? You can't, no, we can't consider that.
That's right.
I mean, I'm sorry, I'm stunned at, I called you on the phone and you were like, oh, no, you're not, we're headed towards evil stuff. We're headed for a nuclear exchange if it keeps going the way it's going. And I was like, well, this needs to be aired out. I'm going to air it out on my channel. I know I'll get another, from the Ministry of Truth, Google. You got another violation. Oh my God, I talked about something I shouldn't have. But having you on is gold, pure gold, platinum, and whatever. It's, thank you for coming on and explaining what is going on and giving people the other side of here's what we're facing with. And what we're facing is something pretty dark. If it keeps going on the path it's going on, we're facing something really dark. So thank you for coming on. You are also accept donations. You don't have any advertising. You are a 501c3, correct? It is a charitable donation, right? You have books on your page. I'll put all those links up. You are a prolific writer, award winner, and you're not afraid to hang it out there and be ridiculed by the evil that is in this world. So thank you for helping us, and thank you for being on USA Watchdog, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. Thanks again.
Well, Greg, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.